Okay, so we were on the acid-base balance. We started that in the last video, and now we want to talk about the ways that we try to prevent changes in pH. So we talk about these, the chemical buffer systems, the respiratory system, and the renal system. So here, and I want you guys to know where they're effective and what their limits are. All right, so chemical buffer system, this is very quick. So it can quickly bind up excess hydrogen ions or release excess hydrogen ions, but it's limited because there's only so much of each of these things. They are molecules and they're limited. So I say the protein buffering system, plasma has a lot of proteins, but hemoglobin, and we mentioned this in respiratory, right? That hemoglobin can bind hydrogen ions when it's transporting carbon dioxide, right? Because hydrogen ions are formed all the time when carbon dioxide is produced. All right, it is primarily, again, the proteins are then primarily intracellular, because you remember back where we talked about where proteins were. There's not a lot of them outside of the cell or plasma. So this is primarily effective within cells and, of course, within the plasma, which is extracellular, but again, a specific compartment of the extracellular. So I just give you the way this works. Every protein has an amino terminus and a carboxyl terminus. So the amine terminus can release a hydrogen, forming an actual amine group, and this can do this in the presence of excess base. So when there's a lot of base around and you need free hydrogens, this can help. When there is an excess of acids around, the carboxyl end of every protein, because every protein has this and this, can accept a hydrogen ion and therefore, right, prevent a pH change, because that's what we mean by buffer, it prevents something. For phosphate buffer system, this is again intracellular, right, primarily intracellular and plasma, so not the other compartments, extracellular compartments. And it consists of the monohydrogen phosphate ion and the dihydrogen phosphate. Now, you're not going to write this out or remember that. I really said, please know that your buffers are quick and where it is that they are effective. So much like the proteins, this system can deal with excess, right, hydrogen ions or not enough hydrogen ions. Bicarbonate buffer system, we really have talked about already. It is mostly extracellular. A lot of it in the plasma, and I say again primarily in the interstitial fluids. So this bicarbonate ion, right, converts a strong acid, hydrogen ions, to weak ones, carbonic acids. All right, and if you are in a situation where you are highly basic, the carbonic acid can release a hydrogen, so converting a strong base to a weak base. Okay, but the take home is, again, the buffers only minimize the changes in pH. They do not get rid of the acids and bases, and they can be exhausted by the number of ions. So respiratory comes in. Okay, now the respiratory is limited in the acids and bases it can manage, but it can actually get the acids and bases out of the body. It's an excretory system, and it can do this very quickly simply by changing the rate and depth of breathing. All right, so moment-to-moment regulation of carbon dioxide, which leads to carbonic acid. All right, so the respiratory center in the brain is even responding to this pH, right? That's one of the things that trigger, and it's very, very sensitive to this. So here we have a situation of decreased pH, so more acids, and increased pHs, more bases. And said, again, that respiratory center is going to control the rate and depth of breathing. So hypercapnia, so high CO2, right, comes from reduced breathing, heart failure, or impaired respiratory. And high CO2 means, yes, low pH, severe acidosis. And you stimulate these brain receptors to increase respiration. Right? You had it reduced, you got to increase it. So that will decrease the carbon dioxide, which will decrease the carbonic acid, which will increase the pH. If you have alkalosis, right, too much, pH is too high, the brain receptors are stimulated to slow down. In fact, in one of your PhysioXs, you're going to see the simulation stop breathing for a short period of time. This is so CO2 can accumulate, and when CO2 accumulates, carbon dioxide, right, you accumulate carbonic acid, and pH decreases to address the original problem. All right, renal. So again, renal has the ability to manage a lot of changes in acids and bases because it manages a lot of different ions. And it is excretory, so it's going to get it out of the body. The problem is that the renal isn't as fast as the respiratory system, and it's certainly not as handy as the buffer system. But it does actually help, as you see here, create some of the buffers. But again, to get it out of the body, it takes a little bit longer. It's not an immediate change this. So we say that the renal system really addresses metabolic problems, while the respiratory addresses, of course, the respiratory problems, right? Or, respiratory acids and bases. So it takes longer to adjust, but is ridding the body of acids or bases. It regulates hydrogen ion concentration by controlling, right, the amount of hydrogen in the blood, hydrogen ions in the blood, and the amount of bicarbonate. So this is the weak base, this is a strong acid. And we say this is very important right here. Secretion of hydrogen ions, so getting it into the urine, which here's our filtrate, so it would be in here, is linked to the reabsorption of bicarbonate. Okay, so don't forget this association. All right, so disorders. All right, so what happens when we can't maintain, right? Our pH is starting to change. Something's going wrong, and those systems are not working or working well enough, or we're producing too much of something, or some other circumstances led to this imbalance. But again, disorders. So chemical and physiological buffer systems, so the physiological, again, are considered the respiratory and the renal, ordinarily maintain this concentration within a very narrow pH. Right, there's your blood pH is 7.35 to 7.45, and you should know that. Okay, and that's basically what I just said. If it falls below 7 blood pH, you die. If it goes above 7.8, you die. And the basic causes of these imbalances are either going to be the respiratory system itself or the metabolic, something metabolic, which could be a variety of things, including the kidneys. All right, so here we see the symptoms of both, just to let you know what's going to happen here, right, when you're trying to diagnose this in a person. Of course, taking a pH level and taking a level of bicarbonates and carbon dioxide from blood gases, it really is the way you diagnose this, as we'll talk about later. But here's, again, things that you would see in the person. Again, and they can look very similar, with the exception the muscle systems do the opposite. You become seizing, you stop working as much, and here you twitch and spasm. Okay, so metabolic acidosis. This is primarily a bicarbonate deficiency. All right, if we look for the mean, a blood pH of 7.4, and bicarbonate to carbonic acid is about 20 to 1. So you have a lot of bicarbonate compared to, again, the weak acid carbonic acid. So the most common cause is the presence of organic acids or excess ketones in the blood. All right, and so metabolic acidosis. This table is really nice, but again, not for testing specifically. I want to share this with you guys. Again, diarrhea can cause metabolic acidosis because you lose bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is lost in the feces. You didn't have time to reabsorb it as stuff moved quickly through the small intestine, large intestine. All right, uremia, so problems with the kidneys. Again, diabetic ketoacidosis, as I mentioned up here. Strenuous exercise can lead, but this is usually transient. These ones can be more serious. Again, if they're transient, you probably recover, but if they're not, then we do have a problem. I said the first 4 of these are considered medical. Others are due to something you've ingested, a toxin. Again, uremia is retaining urea, right, just explaining what that word means, and uric acid due to kidney disease. So kidney disease can clearly lead to metabolic acidosis. All right, metabolic alkalosis, primarily bicarbonate excess. So this is, again, your metabolic is really hinging on this idea of the bicarbonate ion. Too much in the blood. Following gastric drainage, right? Because in gastric drainage or prolonged vomiting, where you lose stomach contents, you've lost hydrogen ions. So the ratio of bicarbonates to hydrogens, or acids, again, bases to acids, is imbalanced. Can happen if you had taken too many antacids as well. So again, it's too much bicarbonate formed from that. Potassium depletion can lead to this. I mentioned this when I was talking about the hypokalemia earlier on another video. So Cushing's disease, in which the person makes too much aldosterone, causes you to secrete a lot of potassium. Diuretics can lead to this, and laxatives. Again, what it means is less potassium in the body means that hydrogen is exchanged with sodium in the tubule, and that means more bicarbonate accumulates because this hydrogen is lost. All right, respiratory imbalances, right, are primarily due to carbonic acid and CO2. So this is the primary reason. So acidosis is excess carbon dioxide from anything that interferes with respiration, and respiratory alkalosis is deficiency of carbon dioxide, generally from hyperventilation, which can occur from fever, anxiety, or hypoxia. All right? Compensation. So how do you deal with this? So respiratory compensation for this is that chemical buffers resist the pH change, right? So they try to prevent the pH from climbing, becoming more basic or becoming more acidic, and they try to reestablish that bicarbonate to carbonic acid ratio, that 20:1. So increasing levels of carbon dioxide mean acidosis. So we've been saying this since the respiratory chapter, right? So this should be pretty old news to you, right? And increasing carbon dioxide stimulates you to breathe faster and deeper, and this happens very quickly. Decreasing levels of carbon dioxide is alkalosis, and this, of course, inhibits breathing. So you stop breathing, and I said you're going to see that in one of your physio-X. But this is limited because it is just less efficient at compensating, and eventually, not breathing is not really a good answer. Metabolic compensation. So again, remember we had this problem with bicarbonates when we talked about metabolic acidosis or alkalosis. So chemical buffers, again, resist pH changes. That's always your first line of defense. And again, you're trying to reestablish that bicarbonate to carbonic acid, that 20:1. So in acidosis, metabolic acidosis, we're trying to conserve bicarbonates, right? Because that's a weak base and it will buffer a strong acid. And I said opposites, right? So reabsorb bicarbonate, secrete hydrogen. And again, you're going to see this in your physio-X exercises if you pay attention. Alkalosis, right? Metabolic alkalosis, since this is metabolic, you're going to decrease bicarbonate production, right? Because that's a base. You have enough bases. You have more than enough bases. And you're going to reabsorb or conserve hydrogen ions. And of course, you would see the results of this in a change in the pH of urine. So diagnosing the problem, talking about, we looked at the symptoms previously, but really I said you look at blood gases, pH, and the concentration of bicarbonate to diagnose this, whether it's acidosis or alkalosis, and then whether it's respiratory or metabolic. So pH will tell you which it is here for low pH acidosis, high pH alkalosis. Levels of carbon dioxide usually are used for respiratory, while concentration of bicarbonate is usually a diagnosis for metabolic. But we are looking at compensation here, so we see changes in these things as well. So metabolic imbalances are often kidney disease or diabetes, and so the respiratory system compensates. Respiratory is, of course, respiratory disease, and the kidney compensates, so we want to be aware of this. So here's our compensation, right? Metabolic acidosis, right? Bicarbonate is low, so when compensating, the carbon dioxide levels will decrease in the body so that you can, again, decrease acids. Respiratory acidosis, the carbon dioxide levels are high, and when compensating, bicarbonate will increase, right? In metabolic alkalosis, bicarbonate is high, right? Too much base, and when compensating, the CO2 will increase. In respiratory alkalosis, the CO2 is low, and when compensating, bicarbonate will decrease, all right, in the blood, in the body. All right, so that really sums up what we need to know. It is not a terrifically easy chapter. You have to practice this. Please do so, because we don't get a lot of time before the next test.